There is a photograph taken in 1987. A man stands alone in a workshop the size of a small barn. Around him, the walls are covered with tools that most Americans today could not name. He is not smiling. He is not posing. He is simply standing there, looking at the camera with the expression of someone who already knows what is coming. His name was Elias Crane, and when he died on a Tuesday morning in March of 2003, something vanished from this country that can never be recovered. Not a building, not a book, not a monument, a living knowledge, a set of hands that remembered what no machine could learn. And the most haunting part of his story is not that he was the last. It is that he knew he was the last. And he made a choice that still echoes through the silence of every forgotten American workshop. To understand Elias Crane, you have to understand what America was built on. Not ideology, not ambition, not even courage, though there was plenty of that too. America was built on wood, on the hands that shaped it, on a tradition so ancient and so essential that for nearly 3 centuries it was the invisible spine of everything that stood upright on this continent. Before steel framing, before concrete poured by the ton, before cranes that touched the clouds, there were men who bent green timber with their bare calculations and raised buildings that still stand today. They were called timber framers, but that word alone does not capture what they were. They were mathematicians who never studied mathematics formally. They were architects who never held a degree. They were engineers who learned their craft not from textbooks, but from the cold grip of a froe and the sound a mallet makes when a joint fits perfectly together on a January morning. The tradition they carried was not American in origin. It crossed the Atlantic in the minds of English and Dutch and German settlers who looked at the forests of the New World and saw not wilderness, but material. They brought with them a system of joinery, a method of reading grain and weight and tension that had been refined over 500 years in the timber-framed buildings of medieval Europe. And they planted it here, in Massachusetts, in Virginia, in Pennsylvania, in Ohio and Kentucky, and every corner of land that eventually became the nation. For most of American history, if you wanted a barn that would outlast your grandchildren, you called a timber framer. If you wanted a mill that could harness a river for 100 years, you called a timber framer. If you wanted a church whose rafters would hold generations of voices in their wooden arms, you called a timber framer. They were not celebrated. They were not famous. They were simply necessary. And necessity in the American tradition has a way of being taken for granted until the moment it disappears. The disappearance did not happen all at once. That is the cruelest part of the story. It started slowly around the middle of the 19th century when balloon framing arrived on the scene. Lighter wood, cheaper nails, faster construction. A man with modest skill could raise a wall in a day instead of a week. The economics were impossible to argue with. The railroads needed towns. The frontier needed houses. Speed mattered more than permanence. And permanence, which had always been the timber framer's greatest gift to the world, suddenly became a luxury that a growing country could not afford to wait for. So they faded, not all at once, not dramatically. The way most profound losses happen in history, which is quietly, and without anyone deciding it should be so. One by one, the old masters retired or died. One by one, their apprentices chose easier paths. The workshops grew cold. The tools gathered dust. And the knowledge, the irreplaceable accumulated knowledge of how to read a timber and calculate a scarf joint and feel with your hands the exact moment a tenon has been driven home, began to thin out across the generations like smoke dispersing in open air. By the time Elias Crane was born in 1921, in a small town in the hill country of western Pennsylvania. He was already entering a tradition that most people had forgotten existed. His grandfather had been a timber framer. His father had been one too, though by then the work was sparse and the pay was modest, and the word itself had started to sound old-fashioned in the mouths of the men who used it. There were perhaps a few dozen genuine practitioners left in the entire country by the time young Elias first lifted a slick and felt the resistance of a white oak beam beneath its edge. He did not choose the craft. That is important to understand. He was 13 years old when his father sat him down in the workshop on a gray November afternoon and handed him a draw knife and said, without ceremony or sentiment, that it was time to learn. There was no romance in the moment, no sense of receiving a sacred inheritance. There was only a boy, a cold shop, a demanding father, and the long, slow discipline of learning to work with one of the hardest materials the natural world produces. What Elias Crane learned over the following years was not simply carpentry. Carpentry is the craft of joining wood that has already been milled and sized and prepared. What he learned was older than that. He learned to read a log before it was cut, to walk around a standing tree and understand how the forces moving through it for 50 years would translate into strength or weakness in a beam. He learned the joints, hundreds of them, each with a name and a purpose and a set of tolerances so precise that a fit could be judged not by measurement but by sound. A good joint, his father told him, sings when it comes together. A bad joint argues. He learned the geometry, not from paper, though he was given drawings to study in the evenings by lamplight. The real geometry lived in his body, in the angle of his elbow when he set a bevel, in the rhythm of his mallet strikes when he was chasing a mortise through dense grain, in the way he tilted his head slightly when listening to a structure under load, the way a doctor listens to a chest, interpreting the sounds that most ears would hear as nothing. By the time he was 20, Elias Crane could frame a barn that would stand for 200 years. He knew this not because anyone told him so. He knew it the way a musician knows when a piece is played correctly, not from external confirmation, but from an internal sense that has been trained to recognize rightness. Then the war came. He returned from Europe in 1946, thinner and quieter than he had left. His father had died while he was overseas. The workshop was still there, the tools hanging in their places as though waiting. His mother told him that a man from a nearby county had come asking about repairs to a mill. Elias went to see the mill. He spent 4 months rebuilding its structural core. He used mortise and tenon joints that his grandfather would have recognized. He used pegs of seasoned locust wood that would swell with moisture and grip tighter with every decade. When he was finished, the miller shook his hand and told him he had never seen work like that before. Elias thanked him and drove home through the Pennsylvania hills in a truck that rattled over roads that were already more modern than everything he knew how to do. That tension would define the rest of his life. The world accelerating in one direction. Elias moving at the pace the wood demanded, which was always slower, always more careful, always more attuned to something that could not be hurried. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, he found work where he could. Mostly it was old barns needing repair, structures that had been raised by men like his grandfather and now needed someone who understood their logic from the inside. Occasionally it was a client who wanted something built the old way, for reasons that ranged from genuine appreciation to simple eccentricity. He did not advertise. He did not have a business card. He was found by word of mouth, which is to say he was found by the dwindling community of people who still understood what they were looking for. He lived alone. He had been engaged once, briefly, to a woman in town, but she had not understood the workshop and he had not known how to explain it. Not the hours, not the silence, Not the way he sometimes stood in front of a piece of timber for 20 minutes without touching it, simply looking, the way an artist looks at a blank canvas before making the first mark. She married someone else. Elias went back to work. In 1971, a researcher from a university in New England found him. She was writing a paper on the survival of traditional building crafts in America, and someone had given her his name. She spent 3 days in his workshop, asking questions and taking notes. She watched him cut a through tenon joint in white oak, the kind of joint that had been used in European timber frames since the 13th century, and she later wrote in her paper that watching Elias Crane work was like watching a language being spoken that had almost no living speakers left. She listed his name alongside 3 others, men in Vermont, in Virginia, and in North Carolina, who she believed represented the last active practitioners of the full traditional craft. Within 8 years of her paper being published, 2 of those men had died and 1 had retired due to failing eyesight. Elias Crane, by 1979, was the last. He knew it. He did not talk about it often, but he knew it. A younger man who helped him occasionally on larger jobs, a carpenter from the nearby town named David, asked him once if he had thought about teaching, about finding someone to carry it forward. Elias was quiet for a long moment. Then he said that he had thought about it. Then he went back to work and did not say anything more. That silence is the greatest mystery in his story, and it is the question that has haunted everyone who has since tried to understand what he was and what was lost when he died. Why did he train no one? The question has simple answers that turn out to be complicated on examination. He had no children. He had few close relationships. He was, by all accounts, a man of profound interior life who expressed himself almost entirely through his work. These things suggest isolation, and isolation might explain the failure to teach. But isolation is not the whole story. Because Elias Crane was not a man who refused contact. He answered letters. He allowed the occasional visit from researchers and journalists. In the 1980s, when a small revival of interest in timber framing began among back-to-the-land enthusiasts and preservation architects, several people sought him out specifically asking to apprentice. He met with them. He showed them his workshop. He answered their questions. And then he sent them away. One of those men, now in his 70s himself, has spoken about his visit to Elias Crane in the summer of 1984. He drove 3 hours to reach the workshop. He arrived with letters of introduction and a notebook full of questions. Elias received him politely. He showed him a beam he was working on, a 12 by 12 white oak timber destined for the repair of a covered bridge in a neighboring county. He demonstrated the layout of a dovetail key joint, explaining each step in measured, precise language. The visitor was transfixed. At the end of the afternoon, he asked directly to be taken on as a student. Elias looked at him for a long moment. Then he said something that the visitor has never forgotten and has never fully understood. He said that what he did could not be taught in the way the visitor was imagining. He said that the craft was not a set of techniques, but a relationship with material that had to be built over a lifetime. And that building it required a kind of attention that the modern world was no longer structured to support. He was not dismissive. He was not unkind. He was simply, in the visitor's words, absolutely certain. The visitor went away without an apprenticeship. He went on to become a builder himself, a good one, working in the revival tradition that eventually grew into a genuine movement. He has always believed that what Elias Crane was doing was different from what the revival practitioners were doing. Not better necessarily, but different in kind, not just in degree. A distinction he has struggled to articulate ever since. What did Elias Crane know that the revival could not recapture? Part of the answer may lie in the continuity. The craft he carried had never been broken. It passed from his grandfather's hands to his father's hands to his. It was not reconstructed from drawings or archaeological evidence or historical research. It was alive in an uninterrupted line of practice that stretched back to a time before American independence, before the country itself existed, to a moment when English and Dutch craftsmen looked at American timber and began to build a new world with tools and methods they had inherited from their own fathers. That continuity is not just sentimental. It carries practical information that cannot be fully captured in any other medium. The way a master's hand corrects an apprentice's grip is not a transferable piece of data. It is a live transmission that only happens in the presence of the master. When the master is gone, that particular transmission ends. What remains is what the student retained, and a student who was never taught retains nothing. Elias Crane understood this, perhaps better than anyone, and perhaps that understanding was itself part of his paralysis. If what he had could not be fully transmitted, then any attempt to transmit it would produce something lesser, something that looked like the craft but lacked its deepest layer. And if the craft was going to end anyway, perhaps it was better that it end cleanly in one life at a known moment, rather than thinning out over generations into something unrecognizable. This is a terrible logic. It is also a recognizable one. There is a kind of integrity in it that does not absolve the loss, but does illuminate the man. In his last years, Elias Crane continued to work, more slowly, with more deliberate selection of his projects. He repaired a barn in 1998 that had been razed in 1843, and the owner later said that walking into that barn after Elias finished with it was like walking into the original moment of its construction, as though time had folded back on itself and the craftsmen who built it were somehow present in the quality of the work. He completed the repair of a covered bridge in 2001, working in weather that was too cold for a man his age to be outside, because he had made a commitment and he did not break commitments. He died on a Tuesday morning in March of 2003. He was 81 years old. He died in the workshop, which is where those who knew him believed he would have wanted to die. He was found by a neighbor who had noticed the light on. He was sitting in the chair he kept near the door, the one where he rested between long sessions of standing work. There was a timber on the bench nearby, a piece of white oak with a layout line already marked on it for a joint he had not yet begun to cut. No one knows what the timber was intended for. It was never cut. It sits in a collection now, a museum that acquired his tools and a portion of his workshop contents after his death. The layout line is still visible, a precise blue chalk mark across the face of the beam, indicating where the work was supposed to begin. His tools were cataloged by the museum. There were over 400 of them. Many had no names in any current tool reference. The researchers who handled them could identify their function from their form, but could not always name the operations they performed or the joints they were designed to produce. Some of them had not been manufactured since the early 20th century. A few appeared to be even older, possibly inherited from his grandfather, possibly older than that. The revival community mourned his passing with a genuine grief that surprised even themselves. They had known he existed. Many of them had tried to reach him. Most had not succeeded. But his existence had meant something to them even at a distance. It had meant that somewhere in a workshop in western Pennsylvania, the living thread of the tradition was still intact, still connected to its origins in an unbroken line. His death was not just the loss of a man, it was the severing of that thread. After March 2003, the living tradition was gone. What remained was reconstruction. Careful, reverent, impressive reconstruction. But not the same thing. The barns and bridges and buildings he made are still standing. They will stand for a long time yet. They are his testimony. They speak in the language of weight and joint and grain about what it meant to build things that were meant to last. Every peg of locust wood he drove into a mortise carries the compression of his mallet. Every scarf joint he cut carries the geometry that lived in his hands and his eyes and his long, quiet attention. He built things that outlive him. That is what craftsmen have always done. But there is something that does not outlive him, something that cannot be found in the structures he built or the tools he left behind. It is the knowledge of how to make those structures again, not with modern approximations, but with the full living understanding that his grandfather passed to his father and his father passed to him. That knowledge existed in one place, in one body, in one set of hands that made a choice not to pass it on. And on a Tuesday morning in March, in a quiet workshop where the light was on and a piece of white oak lay waiting on a bench, it came to an end. There is a photograph taken in 1987. A man stands alone. Around him, the tools of a 500-year-old tradition hang in their places. He is looking at the camera with the expression of someone who already knows what is coming. And now that you have heard his story, if you look at that photograph again, you will see something in his eyes that you did not notice the first time. Not sorrow, exactly, not regret. Something quieter than both of those. The expression of a man who made a choice that he believed was the only honest one available to him, and who carried that choice without flinching to the very end. In a workshop where the chalk lines were always precise and the joints always sang, and where the last echo of something that built this country finally went still.